The way I look at the unconscious mind is the way I look at the unfolding of consciousness itself. And if I take that in terms of evolution and complexification, basically over long spans of life, you have the various individual life particles or life forms coming together. And I take that coming together as increasing the levels of informational flow.
We want to think that consciousness is a single whole. If you can look at somebody's conscious states, you really understand them. And that would mean that consciousness sort of moves along in a single dimension, right? Everything of what a conscious state is right there on the surface. It's not true.
Most of what the brain is doing is completely unconscious. I mean, it's not simply that you learn to ride a bicycle and it's very difficult and then you forget how you learned it and that becomes a part of you unconsciously, but it's keeping your digestion working and your heart beating and processing of information and so on. All of that is done way below our level of awareness.
What we call mind, we know involves the body, it involves the senses. So what we call consciousness must also involve the body and the senses.
You can begin to actually feel that. In deep enough meditation, you can begin to get much more sensitive about what's going on in your body, and in terms of where your thoughts are arising from and all of that. You can begin to sense that as you go further down.
And so unconscious, levels of unconscious must somehow be not just deeply rooted in the deep structures of the mind, but the deep structures of the body itself. And I think bringing or entering into those levels of unconscious, we know changes not just mentally, it changes us bodily as well.
The awareness itself may not be produced by the brain, but it nevertheless it's correlated with it. So the physical and subjective sides are related in some important ways. So that's what neuroscience studies, and we can't deny that what it sees is real.
Then there are also lots of activities, lots of things going on in our subconscious field of awareness, whether it's subliminal emotions or whether it's perceptual input, all trying to get the attention of that master attention giver at the top of this pyramid of information. So there's sophisticated selection processes going on to select what's going to get the attention and how that's all going to work together. So all of that is unconscious or subconscious, and it's a huge, powerful mechanism that we really don't pay much attention to.
So when we're thinking in our workspace, our mental workspace, there's only a small portion of what we understand that we have there.
Consciousness is a very sophisticated phenomenon, and one of the ways I've heard it described that I really like is that, okay, so we are conscious beings, and we have an activity going on that is aware of very specific parts of our perceptual universe, or very specific thoughts, or very specific feelings, and we can really only pay attention to one thing at a time.
For as much as we've explored outer space and the world of matter, we know still so little about the inner universe of the human person. This universe where there are levels and levels of uncharted territories of consciousness, and what that could mean for us if we could explore those levels of universe more fully, what this could mean for our outer universe. Because I do believe that the inner universe is what, in a sense, shapes the outer universe. So what we're talking about in terms of consciousness, this inner realm of consciousness, is, in a sense, what shapes how we go about the world.
What we see as consciousness, let's say the other person's confidence as he walks through the world and his just certainty that he's right. But the ones who know him well can see that little tick in the eye, that little boyish look of uncertainty, and recognize he may not even be aware of these other states, these unconscious states, but they're there.
Your and my consciousness in trying to manipulate objects through thought is only a small portion of what's going on in our brains and in our bodies. We are understanding all kinds of things about our relationship to the world that we don't bring up into our consciousness. That's the intransitive consciousness, so to speak. We can actually take things from our consciousness and shove it down into our unconsciousness. Take riding a bicycle, for example. When you first start, you have to turn the wheel this way and that way so you don't fall down. But once you've got that memorized, you shove it down into your unconsciousness and you can daydream while you're riding your bicycle.
So sometimes we can have, for example, things in our past that are there, they're circulating in our subconscious, we're not aware of them, and in fact, we may have other systems that have repressed them for various reasons. And perhaps the time arises when some part of this filtering process, the channel is open up, and that memory arises up into our conscious awareness. So that's a very interesting way of thinking about the way psychology works. It's not a simple model. It's a very, very complex system and structure that the unconscious operating that will occasionally feed things up into our conscious awareness that we really need to pay attention to. And meditation is actually a way of trying to open up those channels and become a lot more aware of what might be filtering down there in the big, subconscious that we should be paying attention to.
One of the things you learn in meditation is that you become more and more aware of things that you weren't noticing before. So it's almost as though your level of awareness is beginning to expand. Our metaphor is expanding down into what we would normally think of as unconscious.
Deeper levels of consciousness bring us to a transcendent level of being. There is something that binds us together. We may have our political and economic and social and ethnic and religious differences, but when you get two people together and you put them in the same room at the same table, there is something that binds us together.
To the ancient indigenous peoples, we could see the connection far beyond the particulars of this tribe. The tribe felt itself interconnected with its world and interconnected with all humans on the planet.
Part of the levels of uncharted consciousness, I think, are the levels at the level of divinity, that absolute infinite depth within us. And the more we go into that, the more we find ourselves unified.
If it has to do with our everyday existence in the world, then it must have to do with the spiritual realm. It could be present in everybody at an unconscious level, and it could be expressing itself through synchronicities, through understandable moments, not comprehensible to the person, and yet completely real.
And a big part of that is the intuition part. The intuition is is completely subconscious, and it just bubbles up to the front. And an example I'd like to give is the mathematician Poincare. He was trying to prove a theorem. He was sure that this theorem was right, and he sat down for a couple of days working different ways of trying to prove the theorem. He was completely unsuccessful. So he set it aside and he went off on vacation. About a week later, as he was stepping off of a carriage onto the street, when his foot hit the street, the idea came to his mind of the complete proof of that theorem. And it occurred just in a flash. And he understood that it was correct. He didn't even have to go write it down. And at his leisure later that day, he went and wrote down the theorem and verified that it was correct. So that's an example of intuition. If you have an intuition about something that's going to happen out there in the world, there's probably some subconscious things that have happened, and it's making the connection that, hey, this means that this might happen.
I think Carl Jung was just right about a collective unconscious, a structure of thought that we inherit.
In the last century, we've come to understand more of what this collective unconscious is. Jung said that there are certain fundamental symbols that express core features that are at the collective unconscious of all people around the world. Actually, Wagner wrote symphonies like Parzival that were built on that collective unconscious. In my belief, in dreams, the collective unconscious can be expressed. We begin to see things that we couldn't see in our daily life, but inside that unconscious, we recognize connections, longings, fundamental features of who we are, that then come to consciousness, become a living, breathing part of our conscious self. So much of who I am and what I'm doing lies at that unconscious level. And that's one of the reasons why I think that even the atheist, even the one who denies the existence of spirituality most clearly, at an unconscious level, experiences the very spirituality that he denies.
The lore is that if you go all the way down and you dissolve back, your awareness dissolves back into this primordial awareness, that's what somebody would say would be a classic mystical experience. That there's no self anymore because you are the universe at that point. If a Hindu says that Atman equals Brahman, that is what they mean. That the Atman is kind of this ego here, and the Brahman is when I dissolve back into the awareness of everything.
The collective unconscious may be what Plato once called the world soul.